women first have to prove that they're credible, then they have to prove that they're likable and credible, and men prove that they can do the job.
Welcome to the Unquiet Sisterhood, a place where we can talk about real life, work, love, and more from a feminist perspective. I'm Jen Pavich, your host, and now let's dive right in. Hey there, welcome to episode 5. Today I'm talking with Talan Tyminski, a speaking coach who helps women overcome public speaking anxiety, succeed at work, and run for office. Talan's own journey took her from struggling with anxiety, shyness, and a speech impediment to being a nationally ranked public speaker and coach. Talan loves working with women in politics and helping them find their voice. Most recently, she worked with Danielle Skidmore on her campaign for the Austin City Council. And for those of you who don't know of Danielle, she was the first trans person to run for office here in Austin. So I will have all of Talan's information in the show notes, and let's get started. Talan, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Of course, I'm so excited.
So let's get started. I have to say the first thing that struck me in your bio was from speech impediment to competitive speaker. Let's talk about that. What did that look like and how did that happen?
Definitely. So when I was real little, I couldn't pronounce anything with R's or S's. So like the cute little kid thing of Waymbos, except it was like when I was 12 and people were over it. So I spent a lot of time in speech therapy, and that gave me a lot of shyness. I didn't really want to talk in front of people because I was worried that I'd revert to those speech impediments. And it wasn't until high school that I really got into public speaking. My sister actually, when I was picking out like your high school elective, she was like, you should not take debate. You'll hate it. You'll hate it so much. And I'm very stubborn. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take it. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And like part of the class was that you have to go to a tournament for your final. So I went to a tournament and I won the tournament and I was like, oh, this is fun. They give me trophies. Yeah, that's really how I got started in it.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, and then that led to, I'm guessing, debate in college and then competitive public speaking on a national level. So this is something that I kind of vaguely knew existed, but I don't know much about. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit more about what that looks like and what it's like, especially as a woman, because I'm guessing that it might be a male-dominated sport, if we can call it a sport, activity.
I think it's definitely a sport. After high school, I was recruited on scholarship to compete in college. The world of competitive speech is a little bit crazy. You can do 11 different events, ranging from everything from like interp and acting to public addresses, where you can do an informative one or a persuasive one or a funny one. The events that I really focused on were limited preparation events. So the two main ones were extemp and impromptu. Impromptu, I got 1 minute and 30 seconds to look at a quotation or a prompt and then stand up and give a 5-minute speech, just like right away. And the other one, extemp, I was given 30 minutes and a question about the world. So everything from who will win the 2020 election to how should Greece fix its economy. And then in those 30 minutes, I got to do whatever research I could. And then I just had to stand up and give it right away. And especially in those limited preparation events, I found myself being the only woman in the room.
Wow. Why do you think that is?
I think because traditionally in speech, they were separated by gender. So for a long time, the speech community had women's extemp and men's extemp. And because they are such heavy topics that those who generally do well in them have a commanding presence. They're seen as the authority on the issue. And that's something that I found, especially with working with women, that like societally, we've been coached to believe that we won't be the expert on it, or there are people that are smarter than us, so that we don't come off as commanding. So it often gives a little bit of competitive success to the men.
Wow. Yeah. And that just, in the work that I do, I work with a lot of women who are dealing with, kind of imposter complex or perfectionism. And I would imagine both of those things would make the kind of doing it on the fly aspect of those type of speech events to be really difficult. Um, so that's fascinating. When did they become coed?
I believe it was the late 80s, early 90s, so not too long
Wow.
ago.
Okay. That's a
Uh,
long time to hold on to the
yeah,
separateness.
and people make jokes about it today, but there is still a real big divide in that when you look at the national final rounds, like people who have been through 6 rounds of competition are named the top 6 in the country, a majority of them are men consistently year after year, despite the fact that it's a circuit or a community that says they really want to promote women and help women achieve, yet their judging has an implicit bias in it that promotes men.
Wow. Okay, which brings me to my next question, which is about another area in our world that promotes men and has a lot of implicit bias. Let's talk about politics. So, for one thing, I would imagine like the impromptu and accent speaking that you did was probably really great training for teaching people how to kind of move on the fly in terms of responding to things that are happening, which is, very, very good skill to have in political campaigns. How did you kind of come to coaching women to run for office?
I've always loved working with women in public speaking because I think a lot of the structures we have in place, whether that be through school or Toastmasters or whatever, is really centered towards men. Everything's like textbook of you need to be commanding, you need to have a low voice, you need to gesture on certain things, and it's all just really geared towards men. A few months ago, I was watching a bunch of women locally who were heads of companies give presentations about what they do and how they got there. And I was like, these are so awesome, but they're terrible to watch because they aren't communicating at all. And that's when I first realized that I had the potential to work with women and really help them. And in the aftermath of 2016, when we saw over 400 women running for office, there was really a growth in the need to talk about how women are perceived as candidates and how they speak in public and how that influences things.
So tell me more about that, about how women are perceived as candidates and how they speak in public, and how does that change depending on the audience?
Yeah, so back when Reagan was running for office, he kind of put out this idea that a politician needs to be likable, that you have to sit down and want to have a beer with them, which is now translated into likability, which you'll see related to Elizabeth Warren or Hillary Clinton, that they're just not likable enough. Well, that's not really applied to men in the same way, right? Women first have to prove that they're credible, then they have to prove that they're likable and credible, and men, you just kind of have to prove that they can do the job. And for women candidates, I think it's especially hard when you use so much social media and digital advertising, because a lot of the things women are really good at are that one-on-one communication, making people feel like they are really special in that conversation. And so when you have to rely on this mediated communication, you kind of lose that. And that's when we get back to this likability concept. There was a really cool study not too long ago in which they took a political ad and they had the exact same ad run with a woman in it and a man in it. Same words, same everything. And they showed it to a group, and the group said that the woman was yelling at them and angry at them, but that they wanted to have a beer with the guy. And they were the exact same
Wow.
words. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not surprising when you think about, because women deal with that likability factor in kind of every area of life, right? It's the thing that we're almost supposed to aspire to above all else. And it's
Yeah.
interesting to see how that plays out in politics, because what I hear you saying is that kind of where women really excel is connection and empathy
Yeah.
when they're in one-on-one conversations. And what we expect to see from someone on a stage is different than that.
Exactly. It's also why you see women being successful at local races. We saw, especially in 2018 midterms, a lot of women win on the local level and in the congressional level. And that's really interesting because there's some studies out there looking at the idea that we view congressional candidates or Congress people as being more collaborative, right? And if you are a governor, if you are a president, you need to be more independent, you need to be more assertive. And so we vote for women for Congress because women are naturally more collective. We work together better. We have that empathy that really needs to be there. But we aren't voting for women in the same way for positions that we see as solo. There are only 9 women right now who are governors of states, and 5 of them were elected in 2018.
I think you may have just described the reason for kind of, at least part of the reason for the glass ceiling in the business world as well. I think it's this perception of women as not necessarily being executive material, but being more part of the hive.
Yeah, exactly. It's really a perception that's kind of ingrained in us. Like, you don't think about it on your everyday basis. You're like, oh, that woman seems to be doing well in a group, but it's not, oh, they're doing well in a group because societally they've been in charge of groups. They've been working in a communal setting. It's just such an implicit bias that it's hard for us to shake a little bit.
Yeah. And I think it's even, often a bias that women have as well as men.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that a lot of times with our biases, when they get called out, our immediate response is to say, oh, no, that's not what I think. But on an unconscious level, a lot of times this stuff is operating, whether you think it on an intellectual level or not.
Definitely. And I think we've already seen that looking at 2020 and the candidates that are running. One of the first things that ran about Elizabeth Warren after she announced was if she's living in Hillary Clinton's shadow and if she's likable enough. And it was just Politico wrote this entire article about it, about whether she was likable enough to be president, despite the fact that Trump's approval ratings haven't gotten above 40%. Like, likability is a sexist term that we're using.
Yes, it is. So you've gotten to see a lot of women run for office, and you have this, really interesting perspective from a public speaking lens. So tell me about what you think people expect to see from women versus men when they're speaking in public.
Yeah, so this is actually really interesting because it goes down to your political ideology. Someone who sees themselves as more conservative has an expectation that women will portray traditional gender roles. So they expect to see a woman in a skirt suit. They expect to see her have a little bit of a higher pitched voice, maybe be a little less commanding on things. And I think when you think about Republican women who have run for office, Sarah Palin is always the example, right? She portrayed that traditionally female mindset. Like, you look at her and she almost had a girly aspect to her. Mm-hmm. Versus liberals, they want to see those gender norms be bent, right? That's why we see Hillary Clinton in a pantsuit. It's the iconic image of, oh, this is a little bit more masculine. I'm okay with this. This is progress. We see it as defiant, and they really want to support someone that's being defiant.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, and it is something that you kind of see across the board. You're right on both sides. That's how it plays out. The other thing that I'm really intrigued by, and this is something that you see both in terms of, people speaking in front of a crowd and also kind of in a sense of TV interviews and that kind of thing. And that's the concept of women and anger in politics is very fascinating for me, because I feel like in some ways, and this sort of flips that a little bit, that women on the right have more freedom to express anger. And I'm not sure if that's because anger seems to be sort of the driving force of the right, or if it's just kind of more culturally acceptable. But how have you seen that play out for women in politics?
So I think that's really interesting because anger is something that's associated with women whenever they're being assertive, right? Mm-hmm. So you walk this fine line of being meek and nice, and people say that you're not qualified because you are too nice. But if you're assertive, you get called a bitch, and then you're angry, mm-hmm. and people just don't want to vote for that. I think the interesting thing with Republican women, though, is when they do get angry, it's about things that they're claiming a moral ground on. So it's almost further playing into that idea of traditional gender roles. If you think of the abortion debate, right? Mm-hmm. You see pro-life women getting very angry about that, but it's viewed as a women's issue, something that they're protecting the family, that they're protecting our values. Versus if you see a liberal woman get upset about pro-choice rhetoric, you see that they are defying moral values. They're going against what women should traditionally want, and it's breaking that. And that's where we get the divide of people being like, oh, she's too angry about something bad versus, oh, she's being protective of what we want in society. So I think that all comes down to how we view our government. If we view it in a way that we want it to be this conservative government or this liberal government, it changes how we view women, and especially when it comes to their anger and what is acceptable anger.
Yeah, what constitutes righteous anger?
Yeah.
In the eye of the beholder. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. So let's talk a little bit about, cast our minds back just briefly, because I know we don't want to go back there. But let's talk about the 2016 election. So tell me about what you were seeing maybe in the debates, and maybe even if you heard other people in kind of the public speaking world talking about perceptions around the two candidates during the debates. Oh, hell, we can even bring the vice presidential candidates in. What were you hearing?
Yeah, so I think with debates, it kind of goes back to that anger issue. When Hillary let Trump talk and do whatever Trump does, she was seen as weak, not wanting to be combative with him. But when she stepped up and talked over him or pushed back in any way, again, she got called like aggressive or assertive, all because she was just trying to push back and have a debate. And it's not like political debates are the most formal thing. Like, we've seen candidates get angry with each other and talk over each other. But when it's a woman versus a man, it's seen as her being too aggressive. And I think a lot of that comes from the interesting base that we've seen from Trump. These are supporters that are diehard Trump fans, not a specific policy, but the person, like the dogma surrounding him. So it's almost like he can do no wrong. And if Hillary tries to push back and be assertive and show that she can basically like hold her own, they just view that as her being overstepping and overambitious in what she's trying to do. I also think a lot of it came down to how the media covered things. And even now, I think that's really interesting. So the media would run articles on Hillary, like when she was sick, that talked all about her strength. But at the same time, Trump wasn't really supposed to win, right? When the media covered him, it was never our next president. It was always, look at what Trump's doing now.
Sideshow, yeah.
Yeah. And so he was covered in this lighter way, and Hillary was just so critiqued in every media outlet. It was something like the New York Times in 6 days ran more articles on her emails than they had about like her policy in the last 70 days of the election. And it's just so critical rather than being critical of both candidates. And I think that's something we are even seeing now. If you're looking towards the idea of talking about gender in politics, a lot of the articles that come up are from Vogue, Teen Vogue, Glamour, not Politico, New York Times, the place where you normally expect to get political information. And I think that's kind of created a change. You saw more women than ever run. More women are interested in politics and donating. And I think it's interesting that the shift in media from 2016 might be what's sparking a change.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I also think, so given that we did see so many more women run in this past election, what did you see in terms of how women were presenting themselves or, speaking in front of audiences, that kind of thing, that surprised you this election cycle?
Yeah, so traditionally in politics, women candidates have run on what people call women's issues, which is not really a thing because every issue is a women's issue, but the traditional women's issues, talking about equal pay, things like that. But in 2016, they kind of bucked that narrative and just ran on being themselves, being different. And the fact that they really embraced who they were is really interesting to watch. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she literally ran on being her. She didn't try to cater to a women's platform. Even Kirsten Sinema out of Arizona, when you look at like the things she's doing in Congress right now and the fact that we're having debates about whether her over the knee boots are appropriate does not really matter. Like, she ran on being her and being an openly bisexual.
Yeah, it was an incredibly diverse slate of candidates all over the US that were not trying to be homogenous in the same way that we've seen that happen in the past.
Yeah, and I think part of that is younger voters. We're seeing a new pool of voters coming out and really enjoying candidates that they can connect with, that they're like, oh, this person is like me and I want to vote for them. Kind of in a strange way, the same thing that got Trump supported, right? He was being himself. He was being, as people call him, authentic. But these women are flipping the script on it, being authentic in a way that they are working to protect people rather than working in their own best interest.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and you had a more personal stake in this last election because you were, during the election, speech coaching Danielle Skidmore for her campaign for Austin City Council. Tell me about that. What was that experience like?
That was an amazing experience. So Danielle Skidmore, if you don't know her, she was the first openly trans candidate for Austin City Council. She's a transportation engineer and super smart. She unfortunately lost her race, but she's still doing some really great things, promoting everyone's rights in the community. And it was a really interesting coaching experience because we dealt with the issue of gender when it came to how she was presenting herself. Because Austin is a fairly liberal town, but there's still the idea that when you are someone who has recently transitioned, you are trying to embody the gender norms that society has given you. So at times she would go very feminine in her delivery style when she could pull it back and go a little masculine because that's what Austin likes. Austin is a liberal place. We can play with that gender a little bit
We
more.
like to see strong women here. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was really fascinating to play with the idea of gender and politics and really just see her grow as a person. I felt like a lot of our sessions ended with her being like, I'm exhausted emotionally. Like, I felt like we went through a lot just to try to get a word change or an inflection change. And it was just a really great experience.
That's awesome. So, and just hearing you say this and thinking about, how we tend to like our female politicians here in Austin brings me to the thought that we also live in Texas, and being a woman in Texas is kind of its own unique experience. And I know that you've competed both inside and outside of Texas. What has that been like for you?
It's a really interesting experience. I think in Austin, sometimes we get in this bubble where we're like, oh yeah, like everything's great. Everything's progressing in the way I want to see it.
This is what Texas is like. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you travel someplace else and you're like, oh, you did just tell me that my shirt is too low to be taken seriously. That's kind of offensive. Like, maybe you should listen to what I'm saying. And I think it's kind of picking what battles you want to take, right? You can either, if you're in a competitive sense, go for that winning and play into the gender norms, or if you just want to butt up against the gender norms, you can try to break those. But I think one of the biggest problems is trying to do both at the same time, especially if you're not in an area like Austin. And I think that's kind of what we've seen in large-scale races in the state. If you think of Wendy Davis, she had massive support across the nation, but she bucked up against gender norms. So in places like rural Texas, they're not going to vote for her in the same way because she was fighting a battle over what it's like to be ladylike versus I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. And that's a really unfortunate situation to be in. Hopefully, as this blue wave comes, we won't have to pick our priorities. But I think that's where we are as a state.
That's what we're hoping. Yeah, because we see women butt up against those norms in so many areas of life, right? It's kind of this razor thin line that we're expected to walk where we're, not to this, but not to that,
Yeah.
That's just ridiculous and takes so much time and energy to kind of try and thread that needle. So as a speech coach, when you look at, you mentioned that you went to like a bunch of presentations of sort of heads of companies talking about what their companies do and that kind of thing. What are some of the sort of mistakes, or not mistakes, but things that you see women do that are kind of like the low hanging fruit that you sort of start to work with them on? And what are some, some things that women are probably doing when they are up in front of a group speaking that they might not really realize that they're doing?
Yeah, so I feel like the biggest one that everyone wants to talk about is upspeak and vocal fry. This is a big issue, but it's honestly not.
Can you explain what that is for our
Yes.
audience members that might not know?
So upspeak is ending a sentence on an up pitch, almost as if you're asking a question. It's often associated with women, but both women and men do it. The reason it stands out in women is because we're already fighting this issue with credibility, and men are automatically given that credibility. So if they're asking questions with their sentences, no one thinks anything of it. But because women have to fight for our credibility, when we're asking those questions at the end of our sentences, people think we don't have the knowledge to be talking about them.
It's kind of like the perception that uncertainty is weakness.
Yes, exactly. So that's usually one of the first things I tackle, is trying to get people to end their sentences on a down pitch. And sometimes that's as simple as, let's record you and listen back to it because you're unaware that you're doing it. Or a stop and start of, hey, you just ended that sentence weird, let's do it again. And eventually it kind of becomes an internalized thing of, oh, I need to end my sentences in a different tone. I would say that's probably the biggest. One of the others is that when you are taught public speaking in school, you're taught a very specific formula, right? You have your introduction, you have your 3 main points, you have your conclusion. When we're talking about the data that goes in there, a lot of times we are told, you need a statistic here, or you need a source to prove that. Well, I think what's really beneficial for women is we are great storytellers. We're great at relating to people, getting that empathy in there, getting that pathos. So when it comes to forming speeches, I really encourage women to share stories as part of examples, because I think it lends more to their natural speaking style rather than just being like, here are 3 facts that I pulled from some internet source. It's, here's an actual experience that someone had, and here's the fact we can pull from it. It also gives a little bit of personality to the speaker, which I think is another big difference. Is we tell men to just go up there and start speaking, right? But for women, it's a lot of, well, how do we find you being comfortable in front of a room? How do we give you that credibility? And a lot of it's just finding your personality, because women a lot of times do have a personality that lends towards collectivism. So if you can let that show, people are going to feel a connection to you, which gets that credibility.
Yeah, and it almost goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like the whole empathy and connection thing that comes across in a one-on-one situation. So it sounds like you're able to help women figure out, how do I take that from just my one-on-one interactions to a larger kind of group interaction?
Yeah, exactly.
And can you explain to us what vocal fry is?
Oh,
because I know that's another one that we hear the term thrown around a lot, but I haven't heard a good definition of it.
So it's when you're talking and your words kind of are drawn out and almost get cracky in the middle. You'll hear it a lot if you listen to like radio broadcasts. You'll hear that kind of crackling going on. That's vocal fry. And it's something that has to do with how much air you are able to push out as you are speaking, which is something I also work with women on. Is we were never really taught how to project, because women are supposed to be soft-spoken, so why would we need to project? So I work on breathing with them a lot to figure out how we push that air out and make sure that every word you're saying has that energy behind it.
That's awesome. So when you work with women, what does that typically look like? If, for example, one of our listeners is, I don't know, thinking of running for office or just wants to be able to present better at work, like what does working with you look like?
Yeah, so I do an introductory session where we play around with some different activities. If you have a specific project, we'll lay at that project just so I can get a feel of where you are. And then it's a lot of drills. I've done things where we play catch outside while you're talking to me and giving a speech, or we go for a walk and put it in different settings and really try to get you to relax into what you're doing. There's also a lot of, hey, let's stop and redo that sentence and try it this way, and playing around with different things. I like to think of it as personal training, but for your speaking, because it'll be a little different every time, and we'll do different exercises, and it's just a matter of building up those muscles to a point where you can pick up any speech and just go with it.
That's fabulous. So if people want to find you, where can they do that?
Yeah, so if you want to find my business, you can find it at pitchatx.com or on Instagram at pitchatx. If you just want to follow me, I'm on Instagram at @tptym.
And we'll make sure that we put all of those in the show notes as well. So thank you so much for being on today, Talan. It's been so fascinating to talk about this and kind of get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain at what may be happening with all of our wonderful women that are stepping up and running for office, which is so super important. So thanks for being on the podcast, and I hope to have you back again sometime.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.